I froze in the doorway as a sickening sense of déjà vu washed over me. It was all happening again, exactly as it had in my previous life. My brother, Julian, was hovering over the hospital bed, his hand reaching toward Isabella just as her eyes began to flutter open. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice dripping with a calculated, urgent smoothness. "You can't trust Davis. Your husband only married you for your fortune while you were lying here unconscious." Those words struck me with a familiar, piercing sting, like the phantom pains of an old, unhealed wound. This was the precise moment and the exact lie that had systematically dismantled my entire first life. However, everything was different this time around. I was no longer the naive younger brother who believed in family loyalty. I remembered every detail of the betrayal, the crushing loss, and the sensation of the icy water closing over my head. Julian looked up, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly when he noticed me standing there. He was clearly expecting me to react with shock, or perhaps blind rage. Instead, I forced my features into a mask of stunned disbelief, letting my jaw hang slack while my mind raced with cold, hard calculations. I decided to let him believe he held the upper hand and let him play his little game. This time, I was the one who knew the rules. It felt as though it had happened only yesterday, even though it had been 3 years since these events unfolded in my previous life. In that past life, Julian had cornered me in the study, his usual polished charm replaced by a desperate edge I hadn't been able to decipher back then. "Davis, you have to help me," he had pleaded with a look of feigned sincerity. "The Harrison family is demanding a marriage to secure the merger. It has to be one of us," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the sprawling New York City skyline outside the window. "Their daughter, Isabella, is in a vegetative state," he said, leaning closer until the scent of his expensive cologne became suffocating. "They need someone to marry her formally, just a legal arrangement on paper. The doctors say she won't last more than 6 months," he continued, his eyes, which were usually bright with confidence, darting around the room nervously. "Just think about it, little brother. You marry her, wait it out, and eventually you become an incredibly wealthy widower. It saves the family business, it helps me out of a jam, and you'll be set for life." Back then, I was just Davis, the reliable sibling who always cleaned up Julian's messes. The merger was vital for the family empire our father had built, an empire that Julian was currently running straight into the ground. I eventually learned the truth, but at the time, I was hesitant to marry a woman I had never met who couldn't even give her consent. It felt morally wrong, but Julian painted it as a noble duty and a necessary, temporary sacrifice for the sake of our name. He swore it was nothing more than a legal formality, so I finally gave in. I signed the documents and stood awkwardly beside a hospital bed while a lawyer droned on with legal jargon. That was the day I officially became Isabella Harrison's husband. Against all medical odds, Isabella woke up 3 months later. I still remember the flicker of cautious hope I felt the first time I saw her eyes clear and find their focus. Unfortunately, Julian got to her before I could. He spun a web of lies, painting me as a greedy vulture who had forced a dying woman into marriage just to steal her inheritance. He cast himself as the noble brother who had desperately tried to protect her from my schemes. He pretended to be her sole protector while she was still confused, vulnerable, and suffering from fragmented memories. Isabella believed him, and why wouldn't she? He was the charming, charismatic Julian, while I was just the quiet stranger who was suddenly her husband. The end of that first life was utterly bleak. Julian and Isabella united against me, systematically stripping me of everything I owned. I lost my position in the company, my shares, and my entire reputation. They portrayed me as a monster to the public, and even my own mother took their side. I ended up completely alone and penniless, standing on the railing of the George Washington Bridge. The wind whipped around me, carrying the cold scent of the river far below. I remember the fall, the bone-chilling impact, and the descent into icy blackness. Then suddenly I woke up. I wasn't in the dark water anymore. I was back 3 years in the past. The sharp, sterile smell of hospital antiseptic filled my nostrils. I was sitting right beside Isabella's bed, only hours after I had signed the marriage certificate. Julian was leaning in, clapping me on the shoulder with a grin. "You're saving my life, little brother," he said, his voice thick with a layer of false gratitude that I could now see right through. His gold watch, the one I had bought for him with my very first performance bonus, flashed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Seriously, Davis, I owe you one for this." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. He claimed I was saving his life, while in reality, he was condemning mine. But this time was different because I was no longer the fool he took me for. "Anything for the family, Julian," I replied, forcing a warm smile onto my face. I met his gaze and held it just a second longer than necessary. I wanted him to see nothing but compliance so that he would continue to underestimate me. In the weeks leading up to Isabella waking up, I didn't just sit by her bedside wallowing in self-pity like I had the first time. This time, I took decisive action. I obtained copies of her entire medical history and spent my nights poring over medical journals, researching experimental treatments for patients in persistent vegetative states. I consulted with top specialists discreetly, using untraceable burner phones to ensure my preparations remained a secret. When I signed that marriage certificate this time, it wasn't an act of naive sacrifice. It was the opening move in a high-stakes game that I had already lost once before. This time, I was playing to win. The board was set and the pieces were already in motion, but now I knew exactly where every single one of them was supposed to go. Living through these events a second time meant seeing everyone in my life through a completely different lens. Their masks were still firmly in place, but now I could see the rot festering underneath. There was Julian, my older brother and the perpetual golden child, who possessed the uncanny ability to talk anyone into anything. Investors loved him and women adored him, and for a long time, I had practically worshipped him myself. Now, however, I could see the sheer desperation hidden behind his designer suits and his practiced, easy smile. I vividly remembered walking into our shared office late one night in my previous life and finding him frantically shredding documents. Tiny paper cuts dotted his fingers, leaving faint bloodstains on his pristine white French cuffs. "Just doing some late-night spring cleaning, Davis," he had said with a forced laugh, quickly shoving the shredded remains into a bin. He claimed he was just getting organized, but I had already seen enough to know better. I had seen the letters with threatening red print and the unmistakable letterheads of notorious loan sharks. His gambling addiction wasn't just a rumor. It was a gaping wound that was bleeding his finances dry. He didn't just want the Harrison merger for the sake of the family company. He desperately needed Isabella's fortune to save his own skin. That explained his frantic urgency and his cold willingness to throw me under the bus. He wasn't just ambitious. He was a cornered animal, and knowing that made him entirely predictable. Then there was my mother, Eleanor, who had never quite forgiven me for being the one who survived the car crash that took my father's life. While she was left with scars that were both visible and deeply hidden, she doted on Julian as the heir apparent. I, on the other hand, was nothing more than a constant, uncomfortable reminder of what she had lost. The evening after Isabella woke up in this life, Eleanor arrived at the hospital room carrying a massive bouquet of white lilies. They were undeniably beautiful and elegant, filling the room with an intense fragrance. They were also the one thing Isabella was most severely allergic to, a fact well documented in her medical records. I met Eleanor at the door to the private suite, physically blocking her entrance. "Those aren't suitable, Mother," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Lilies trigger severe respiratory distress for Isabella, and it is clearly noted in her chart," I reminded her. Her perfectly painted lips thinned into a tight, frustrated line as she held the bouquet out. "Oh, what a shame," she replied. They looked so cheerful. The feigned innocence in her voice was chillingly familiar to me. In my first life, a similar bouquet had mysteriously appeared by Isabella's bedside, and the resulting allergic reaction had caused a major setback in her recovery. That incident had required her to be intubated, allowing Julian to swoop in and play the part of the concerned hero. He had loudly blamed the overwhelmed hospital staff while subtly implying that the mishap was due to my own lack of care. This time, I reached out and took the lilies from her hand. "I'll find a nurse to place these somewhere else, but thank you for the thought," I said. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly for a fleeting second before she smoothed her expression back into a mask of maternal concern. The game was afoot with her as well. My new father-in-law, Lawrence Harrison, was a completely different kind of player. He was the embodiment of old money, incredibly sharp and perpetually calculating. He had agreed to this marriage of convenience because it technically kept the Harrison assets under family control through Isabella, even while she was incapacitated. This arrangement prevented any hostile takeovers while he maneuvered behind the scenes. To him, the marriage was nothing more than a business transaction, a strategic move to secure his flank. In my first life, he had readily accepted Julian's version of events and helped push me out of the inner circle. This time, I made a concerted effort to build a direct connection with him. I initiated weekly chess games, a gesture he clearly appreciated. We played in the quiet hospital garden or in the sanctuary of his private study. He proved to be a formidable opponent. His mind was every bit as sharp as his tailored suits. During one particular game, as he captured my knight with a decisive click, he looked at me over his steepled fingers with shrewd, observant eyes. "You're not at all what I expected, Davis," he remarked in a tone that was impossible to read. "Oh," I asked lightly, keeping my focus on the board. "And what exactly did you expect?" He didn't give me a direct answer and simply continued to study me. "Julian painted a very different picture of you," he noted. The unspoken question hung heavily in the air. Was I better or worse than the person Julian had described? I knew he was constantly watching and evaluating my every move. As a seasoned businessman, he respected a good strategy. I just had to ensure that he eventually realized Julian's strategy was flawed while mine was sound. Dr. Sarah Sterling, Isabella's primary physician, was another crucial piece of the puzzle. She was competent and highly respected, but I knew from my first life that her professional integrity had been compromised. Julian held some sort of leverage over her, likely involving the cover-up of a past medical mistake or perhaps some illicit financial assistance. In exchange, she fed him constant updates on Isabella's condition. She also subtly adjusted Isabella's treatments according to Julian's suggestions, slowing her progress just enough to keep her dependent and confused. This made Julian's narrative of being her sole savior much more believable. This time, I made sure she knew I was paying attention. After noticing a slight, unexplained adjustment in Isabella's medication schedule that mirrored an event from my past life, I decided to act. I requested a formal meeting with Dr. Sterling. I also made it a point to casually mention to a nurse within earshot of the doctor's office that I was having independent security cameras installed in Isabella's room. "It's just for peace of mind," I explained with a concerned smile. With Isabella being such a high-profile patient, one can't be too careful. I'm sure Dr. Sterling understands my concern, especially given the unexpected fluctuations we've seen in her vitals recently, I added. Later, while we were in her office discussing the medication change, I watched her closely and noticed her fingers tightening around her tablet. The sharp, citrus scent of her perfume seemed even more overpowering, perhaps in an attempt to mask the faint smell of nervous sweat. She backtracked almost immediately, blaming the discrepancy on a simple charting error. She assured me it wouldn't happen again, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. She knew I was watching her every move, and she knew I suspected her of foul play. Her loyalty to Julian was now being weighed against her growing fear of exposure. Finally, there was Megan, my executive assistant, who was young, smart, and incredibly efficient. I had trusted her completely in my first life. She handled my schedules, my correspondence, and sensitive company documents. It had been a total gut punch to discover she had been feeding information to Julian the entire time. Julian had found her weak spot. Her mother was battling cancer, and the treatments were ruinously expensive. Julian had stepped in anonymously to pay the medical bills. In return for his generosity, Megan became his eyes and ears inside my office. This time, I set a trap early on. I drafted fake meeting minutes detailing fictitious plans to move personal funds into offshore accounts. It was something that would look highly suspicious, making it the perfect fodder for Julian to use against me later. I placed these documents in a locked drawer in my desk. Then, one afternoon while Megan was organizing my files, I accidentally left the key on the desk blotter while I stepped out to take a phone call. I pretended to be engrossed in my conversation while watching her reflection in the window that overlooked the city. I stood with my back to her, gazing out at the glittering skyscrapers. The silence in the office was profound, but then I heard it, the almost imperceptible rustle of papers, followed by the faint, distinct click of a phone camera shutter. Once then twice. She was quick and efficient, even in her betrayal. When I finally turned back around, the key was exactly where I had left it, and she was diligently filing papers with a perfectly neutral expression. Good, I thought. Let Julian have his evidence. It would fit perfectly into the larger plan I was weaving. They were all moving into position, my intimate circle of villains. My brother, my mother, my father-in-law, the doctor, and my assistant all thought they were weaving a web around me. They didn't realize that this time, I was the spider. The first real move against me came about 3 weeks after Isabella woke up. Julian called an emergency board meeting for Harris Global, and I was pointedly not invited. Davis, buddy, Julian said when I happened to run into him near the executive suites later that day. He draped an arm over my shoulder, his voice oozing with false sympathy. Look, we had a quick board huddle this morning, just some preliminary stuff about the Jensen acquisition. I didn't want to bother you since you've got enough on your plate with Isabella's recovery. Right, we all agreed you need to focus on her. I saw the pitying glances from the executive assistants and heard the sudden halt in conversation as I approached the area. Through the frosted glass of the main conference room earlier, I had seen their silhouettes. Julian was gesturing emphatically while Lawrence Harrison nodded thoughtfully, and the other board members leaned in to listen. The air in the hallway still smelled faintly of Julian's cologne and stale coffee. They hadn't just been discussing the Jensen deal. They were discussing me, my role, my competence, and my trustworthiness. It was just like last time. No, you're absolutely right, Julian, I said, forcing a sense of warmth into my voice. I even managed to flash him a grateful smile. Thanks for covering for me. Isabella is my top priority. The company is in good hands with you and Mr. Harrison. Later that evening, I joined Julian for a glass of whiskey in his office. The expensive bottle and the crystal glasses were all symbols of the success he hadn't truly earned. He poured a generous amount and raised his glass. To family, he toasted. To family, I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The amber liquid burned as it went down, but I swallowed it along with my simmering anger. I clapped him on the shoulder. Seriously, Julian, I appreciate you stepping up like this. Managing the company and dealing with this merger is a lot to handle. Knowing you're handling things allows me to focus entirely on Isabella. The relief that washed over his face was almost comical, and I could see the tension visibly drain from his shoulders. He thought I was rolling over and accepting my diminished role. He probably even thought I was relieved to be sidelined from the corporate drama. You've always been the reasonable one, Davis, he said, swirling his whiskey in the glass. Level-headed. Dad always said that about you. He didn't realize that my reasonableness was now a weapon, honed by my knowledge of the future. While Julian tightened his grip on the company, thinking I was occupied playing nursemaid, I was doing exactly that, but with a purpose. This time, however, I did things differently. I spent hours with Isabella, not hovering over her anxiously, but simply being present. We talked whenever she felt up to it. I didn't push her for information about the past or about our relationship. Instead, I brought things to her like old photo albums I'd asked her father's staff to find. There were pictures of her as a child, laughing with friends and riding horses. I learned that she used to play the piano, so I arranged for a keyboard to be brought to her room. One afternoon, while sunlight streamed into the room, I played some classical music softly, choosing pieces her father had mentioned she loved. Her fingers, still weak from her long slumber, twitched against the blanket. Do you remember playing? I asked gently. She looked at the keyboard and then down at her hands. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a mix of memory and frustration. A little, she whispered, but it feels so far away. Maybe just try touching the keys, I suggested. I sat beside her, lightly guiding her hand. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the smooth, ivory keys. The scent of her jasmine shampoo was faint but distinct in the quiet room. We didn't actually make music, not really, but it was a connection. It was a real moment, not one based on Julian's lies, but on shared patience and the slow rebuilding of trust. I was no longer just her husband on paper. I was becoming the person who was actually there for her, quietly supporting her recovery and helping her find her way back to herself. Meanwhile, I spent my nights very differently. While Julian was busy manipulating the financial projections for the Jensen acquisition, a deal I knew from my first life was fundamentally flawed, I was busy digging. The deal was designed solely to benefit his hidden creditors. I used the access I still technically possessed, along with some newly acquired cybersecurity skills, to gather information. I gathered real data. I documented every inflated projection and every hidden liability that Julian was trying to sweep under the rug regarding the Jensen deal. I compiled spreadsheets comparing his doctored numbers with the actual financials I had pulled from secure servers. I created a clear, undeniable picture of his financial misdeeds related to this specific transaction. The day of the quarterly review meeting finally arrived. It was held in the main Harrison Global Boardroom, a space defined by its polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and panoramic views of the city. The entire setup screamed power. Julian sat at the head of the table, opposite Lawrence Harrison, looking absolutely beaming. He began to present his grand restructuring plan. His plan heavily featured the supposed synergies from the Jensen acquisition. The presentation was slick, filled with corporate jargon and overly optimistic charts. It also involved phasing out several senior executives who were loyal to the Harrison family and replacing them with his own people. He finished his presentation with a flourish. "This acquisition, gentlemen, secures our future," Julian declared. Lawrence Harrison leaned back, steepling his fingers with a thoughtful but cautious expression. Before he could speak, I cleared my throat softly. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I hadn't been expected to contribute at all, merely to observe from the sidelines. "Julian, that's a very compelling presentation," I said calmly. However, I was reviewing some of the figures related to the Jensen deal myself, purely out of interest. I slid several bound copies of my own report across the polished table. I found some discrepancies that might raise concerns regarding the projected versus the actual numbers. Perhaps we should take a look at these before finalizing any restructuring based on this acquisition. A heavy silence fell over the room as the board members picked up the reports. The only sound in the room was the rustle of pages turning. Julian's confident smile froze and then slowly dissolved. I watched as the color drained completely from his face. As he flipped through the pages, he saw his manipulated data laid bare next to the stark reality. His eyes darted toward me, wide with a mixture of panic and disbelief. There must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice suddenly tight. "My team vetted these numbers thoroughly." "I'm sure they did," I replied smoothly. I met his gaze across the long table. "But perhaps a second look is warranted for the sake of due diligence." Lawrence Harrison looked from Julian's pale face to my calm one, then down at the report in his hands. The game had officially changed. Round one was mine. Julian did not take his public humiliation well. He couldn't retaliate directly in the boardroom because my data was solid, and Lawrence Harrison had already put the Jensen deal on hold. Pending a full independent audit, Julian shifted his tactics, hitting me where he thought I was most vulnerable. He and Eleanor orchestrated what they called a family intervention. They cornered me during one of Isabella's physical therapy sessions in the hospital's rehab wing. Isabella was working on her balance, concentrating hard on her movements. When they swept into the room, their faces were etched with faux concern. Dr. Sterling trailed behind them, looking professional but pointedly avoiding my eyes. "Davis, darling," Eleanor began, placing a hand on my arm while her diamond bracelet flashed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "We're so worried about you, and about Isabella." Julian picked up the thread smoothly. "The doctors feel, well, they feel your constant presence might be becoming counterproductive, Davis. It's creating a sort of unhealthy dependency. Isabella needs space to regain her independence." "Is this true, Dr. Sterling?" I asked, turning toward the physician. Dr. Sterling cleared her throat. "Well, Mr. Miller, intensive recovery sometimes benefits from structured independence, allowing the patient to build confidence on their own timetable." Her answer was vague and noncommittal, but it served their purpose perfectly. I looked at Isabella. She looked confused and uncertain, and I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. They were deliberately undermining the trust we had started to build, planting the idea that my care was somehow harmful to her. It was a classic manipulation tactic. It stung because they were using Isabella's well-being as leverage. "I see," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I refused to argue in front of Isabella. I wouldn't let them draw me into a fight that would only upset her. If that's what the medical team truly recommends for Isabella's best interest, then of course I'll comply. I started gathering my bag and the book I'd been reading to her. "I'll adjust my visits. Evenings only, perhaps." Julian nodded magnanimously. "That sounds reasonable," he said. "We just want what's best for her." I bent down to Isabella, who was watching the exchange with a troubled expression. "I'll see you tonight," I said softly, kissing her forehead. Then, leaning closer, I whispered so only she could hear, "Trust me." Her eyes held mine for a moment, searching for the truth. As I walked out with Eleanor and Julian flanking Dr. Sterling, I paused beside the physician. "Dr. Sterling," I said. I extended my hand. "Thank you for your professional assessment." As she took my hand, I slipped a small, folded note into her palm. "Perhaps we could schedule a brief private consultation soon? I have some personal health concerns I'd like to discuss discreetly." Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and she quickly pocketed the note. "Of course, Mr. Miller. My assistant will arrange it." The next day, I sat in Dr. Sterling's sterile office. The citrus scent was even sharper today. I waited until she closed the door before I spoke. I placed a small, high-quality audio recorder on the corner of her desk, making sure the indicator light was clearly visible. "Dr. Sterling," I began. My voice was low and calm. "We need to talk about Isabella's medication records, specifically the alterations made on October 14th, 21st, and November 3rd. The ones documented as dosage adjustments, but which don't align with standard recovery protocols for her condition. They also happen to coincide with her minor setbacks." The color drained from her face. She started to speak, to protest, but I held up a hand to silence her. "I know about the pressure Julian put on you." I continued softly. "I know he helped cover up that malpractice issue from 3 years ago at St. Jude's, and I know he's been supplementing your income." I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply laid out the specific dates, the specific errors in treatment, and the discrepancies I'd found. I had cross-referenced her orders with the pharmacy logs and nursing notes I'd obtained through means she didn't need to know about. The antiseptic smell of her office seemed to close in on her. Her career, her reputation, and her freedom were all hanging by the thin thread of my silence. The recorder sat impassively on the desk between us. "I'm not interested in ruining you, doctor," I said. "I'm only interested in my wife receiving the best possible, unbiased care." Within hours, citing unforeseen personal circumstances that required an immediate leave of absence, Dr. Sterling resigned from Isabella's case. Shortly after that, she left the hospital entirely. I had already researched and vetted a team of top neurological and rehabilitation specialists to take over. They were completely independent and had impeccable reputations. With Lawrence Harrison's somewhat bewildered but ultimately trusting approval, they were brought in, backed by my quiet insistence and vague references to ensuring the highest standard of care. They were brought in immediately. While this was happening, the private investigator I'd hired delivered his first report, which included detailed logs and discrete photographs documenting Julian's movements. The report documented several late-night visits to Dr. Sterling's private residence, not just her office, along with records of untraceable payments made to an account linked to her. It was more fuel for the fire if I needed it. Julian didn't know about the investigator, of course, but he certainly knew about Dr. Sterling's sudden departure. He stormed into my temporary office at Harrison Global the next morning, bypassing Megan and slamming the door behind him. His knuckles were white as he gripped a steaming coffee cup he clearly had no intention of drinking. "What did you do?" he demanded. His voice was tight with fury. "What did you say to Sterling?" "She's gone just like that." The steam from his untouched coffee rose between us like a wall. It was a visible manifestation of his unraveling control. I leaned back in my chair, perfectly calm, and slid a single photograph across the desk. It was a clear shot of him entering Dr. Sterling's apartment building late one night last week. I followed it with a printout of a bank transfer record. "Me?" I asked innocently. I just asked her some questions about Isabella's care. Maybe she realized she was in over her head. I met his furious gaze steadily. I didn't tell her anything she didn't already know. "Julian." He stared at the photo and then at me, his mind clearly racing to find a way out. He was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew and how I had found out. He was starting to realize that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, completely speechless. He grabbed the photo, crumpled it in his fist, and stormed out of the office. He left the untouched coffee cooling on my desk. Round 2 was over, and checkmate wasn't far off. Julian was getting desperate. His attempt to sideline me professionally had backfired, and his manipulation of Isabella's medical care had blown up in his face. He was running out of angles, so he went for the nuclear option, Isabella's inheritance trust. He must have spent weeks poisoning Lawrence Harrison's ear with lies. He had been feeding him doctored reports and whispering concerns about my management. I knew it was coming. In my first life, this was the blow that finally took me out. There were accusations of mismanaging Isabella's vast fortune and leveraging it for risky investments, essentially stealing from my incapacitated wife. This time, I walked into my own home, the large, elegant estate Lawrence had insisted we live in, only to find an ambush waiting for me. Lawrence Harrison sat stiffly on the sofa, flanked by 2 stern-faced lawyers I didn't recognize. Julian stood near the fireplace, trying his best to look solemn and concerned. The air was thick with tension and a lingering aroma of Lawrence's expensive cigars. Papers, financial statements, and investment reports were spread across the low coffee table. It was the table I'd specifically chosen because Isabella could easily reach it from her wheelchair. "Davis," Lawrence began, his voice gravelly and cold. He didn't quite meet my eyes. "We need to discuss Isabella's trust. Julian has brought some concerning investment decisions to my attention." Julian nodded sadly. "I didn't want to believe it, Davis, but the numbers, they look bad. You've made some really risky plays with Isabella's money." I looked at the papers and immediately recognized the strategy. He was twisting legitimate, conservative investments to look reckless, highlighting short-term fluctuations while ignoring long-term stability. It was cleverly done, designed to prey on Lawrence's protective instincts toward his daughter and his fortune. Instead of protesting, I simply picked up one of the reports. I scanned it thoughtfully and nodded. "I understand your concerns," I said, my voice calm and even. "Looking at these isolated figures, I can see why you'd be worried." I met Lawrence's gaze directly. "These are complex portfolios. Allow me 48 hours to gather the full documentation, including performance histories and risk assessments. I'll show you the diversification strategies. I'm confident that once you see the complete picture, your concerns will be alleviated." Julian couldn't hide the flicker of triumph in his eyes. He thought I was stalling because I was cornered. Lawrence, though still wary, seemed slightly mollified by my cooperative stance. He agreed to the 48 hours. As they were leaving, Julian lingered at the door, clapping me on the shoulder with false camaraderie. "It's for the best, Davis," he murmured, his gaze already looking past me. He was no doubt envisioning himself taking control of the trust, just sorting things out. The setting sun cast long shadows across the polished floor as the front door clicked shut, leaving me in the sudden quiet. The final act had begun. I didn't spend the next 48 hours compiling financial defenses. I already had those meticulously organized. Instead, I made a phone call. "Mr. Harrison," I said when Lawrence answered, "could you meet me tomorrow afternoon alone? There's something important I need to show you. It's not about the trust finances, but about why those accusations are being made in the first place." I suggested a location, a small, secluded pavilion overlooking the bay, a place I knew Isabella had loved as a child. He hesitated for a moment, then agreed. The next day, the salt breeze whipped off the water, ruffling Lawrence's thinning gray hair. The pavilion offered a stunning view, peaceful and far removed from the corporate battlegrounds. I didn't bring spreadsheets or investment charts. Instead, I handed him a simple, elegant leather portfolio. "Before we discuss the trust," I said quietly, "I think you need to see this." He opened it. Inside, there was no financial data. Instead, it was the culmination of my quiet work over the past months. There were copies of Julian's gambling debts and evidence of his dealings with loan sharks. I included records of his payments to Dr. Sterling, the investigators' report on their meetings, and copies of the original Jensen acquisition proposal showing exactly how Julian planned to siphon off funds. There was also Megan's sworn affidavit, which I obtained after confronting her with evidence of her spying and offering her a way out if she told the truth. It detailed Julian's every instruction. Finally, I included correspondence from 3 years ago, emails between Julian and his lawyer outlining the initial plan to have me marry the comatose heiress. The plan was to wait for her expected death while he maintained a discreet relationship with Isabella's ambitious cousin, positioning himself to eventually control the Harrison fortune through marriage. He planned to take over after my grieving period was over. Lawrence's hands trembled slightly as he sifted through the documents, photographs, and bank statements. His usually composed face grew pale. Then, his face flushed with anger. The sea breeze suddenly felt very cold. "He planned this? All of it?" Lawrence whispered, looking up at me with eyes filled with dawning horror and betrayal. "He saw Isabella as nothing more than a means to an end," I said simply. "He needed her money to save himself from his own debts. He asked me to marry her, assuring me she wouldn't survive. When she woke up, he needed me out of the way so he could keep her under his thumb. The attacks on my position, the manipulation of her doctors, and the accusations about the trust were all part of his plan to isolate her and gain control." I paused for a moment. I let the weight of my words sink in. "I didn't marry your daughter for her money, Mr. Harrison. I married her because my brother asked me to. But I stayed, and I fought for her recovery, and I protected her assets because I realized I needed to protect her from him." The 48 hours passed, and an emergency board meeting was called. But this time, it wasn't Julian or his lawyers demanding my removal. It was Lawrence Harrison. The atmosphere in the boardroom was electric. A thunderstorm raged outside, mirroring the tempest inside the room. Lawrence, his face grim, stood at the head of the table. Julian sat opposite him, looking confident and expecting his final victory. Lawrence didn't waste any time. Methodically and calmly, he began to lay out the evidence. He didn't present the trust documents Julian expected. Instead, he revealed the contents of the leather portfolio. He presented proof of Julian's gambling debts and his deals with loan sharks. He exposed Julian's manipulation of the Jensen deal, his conspiracy with Dr. Sterling, and his payments to Megan for corporate espionage. Document after document landed on the polished table. There were signed affidavits, bank records, and incriminating emails. Julian's confident smirk evaporated instantly. He started protesting and denying everything, sputtering about misunderstandings and corporate sabotage. His denials grew weaker and more desperate as the evidence mounted. It was irrefutable, much of it bearing his own signature or digital footprint. "He forged these. Davis forged them," Julian finally shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me across the table. He looked wild and cornered. "Tell them, Davis. Tell them this is just your revenge, because I got the CEO position." I didn't say a word. I simply stood up and turned toward the boardroom doors. The doors opened silently, and Isabella entered. She was no longer in a wheelchair. She walked slowly and deliberately, using a single, elegant cane for support. Her steps were steady, and her eyes, clear and sharp, swept across the stunned faces in the room. She looked fully awake, fully aware, and completely in control. She came to stand beside me, and I gently placed my hand over hers on the cane. Lawrence Harrison cleared his throat. As you all know, he announced to the silent room, "My daughter, Isabella, holds the majority voting shares in this company, which she inherited upon coming of age. They were held in trust during her incapacitation, and they're now fully under her own control following her remarkable recovery." Isabella looked directly at Julian, her voice quiet but carrying undeniable authority. "I believe we have a motion on the floor regarding Mr. Julian Miller's position and fiduciary duties. I vote for his immediate removal and a full investigation." Checkmate. Julian didn't even get the chance to clear his desk. Security escorted him from the building, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His key card was deactivated before the elevator even reached the ground floor. The silence he left behind in the boardroom felt heavy and final. Isabella turned to her father. "It's time," she said softly. "Show him." Lawrence hesitated for only a moment, then nodded curtly to his executive assistant. The assistant had materialized silently at the door. We followed Lawrence, not back to the main elevators, but to a private one I hadn't even known existed. It was accessed with a biometric thumb scan. The elevator descended smoothly, going far below the parking garages to a sub-basement level my own access card would never have reached. The doors slid open, revealing not a storage area, but a state-of-the-art research laboratory. It was vast, humming with the quiet energy of advanced technology. Scientists in white lab coats moved purposefully between gleaming workstations. I recognized some of the medical equipment, like advanced EEG monitors. There were MRI components, but much of the equipment was unfamiliar and cutting-edge. Holographic displays shimmered with complex biological data. "This," Lawrence said. His voice echoed slightly in the large space. "This is the real Harrison family business. Not the real estate or the shipping fleets you see on the public balance sheets. Those are just for diversification. This is the core." He swept a hand across the humming lab. "Medical technology, specifically neuroregeneration and cognitive recovery." My mind raced as I thought about the experimental treatments I'd researched and the unexpected speed of Isabella's recovery once Dr. Sterling was removed. "The breakthrough treatment protocol that helped Isabella," Lawrence continued, seeing the understanding dawn on my face, "wasn't just a lucky combination of existing therapies. It wasn't some experimental drug sourced from overseas, as we allowed the official narrative to suggest. It was developed right here. Decades of research culminated just in time." He looked at Isabella, his pride warring with his ingrained habit of secrecy. "Her awakening wasn't a miracle, Davis. It was the first successful human application of the Phoenix Project." Later, we were back in Lawrence's penthouse office, a different one from the Harrison Global Building. This one sat atop a discreet private research institute. The scale of it all became much clearer. The city lights glittered below like scattered diamonds. Isabella hadn't just inherited a portfolio of stocks and properties. Lawrence explained as he slid a thick, bound document across his antique desk. It wasn't a financial report. It looked like a portfolio of patents and research summaries. "She controls the intellectual property, the patents, and the research team. This work will revolutionize the treatment of traumatic brain injuries, strokes, and comas worldwide. The potential value isn't just billions, Davis. It's—" He trailed off, searching for the right word. "Transformative." The leather of his chair creaked as he leaned forward, his eyes, so like Isabella's, sharp and assessing. "She told me something interesting. She told me that even before she woke up, while everyone else was treating her condition as permanent, you were actively researching coma recovery. You were looking into experimental neuro treatments on your own." He paused. "You married a woman who doctors said would likely never wake up. You stood to inherit a fortune if she passed away, yet you prepared for her recovery. You sought out information that contradicted the official prognosis. What?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I couldn't explain my past life or my foreknowledge, but I could explain the actions I took in this life. Because I began slowly. I chose my words carefully. When I agreed to marry Isabella, I took on a responsibility. Even if she couldn't speak for herself, she was my wife. She deserved someone fighting for her best possible outcome. The prognosis seemed too final, and I felt I owed it to her as her husband. Even if it was only on paper back then, I had to explore every possibility, no matter how remote. I met his gaze steadily. Hope seemed like the only decent thing to offer. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod, a flicker of respect in his eyes. The power hadn't just shifted away from Julian. It had shifted toward a future I hadn't fully anticipated, one built not just on revenge, but on unexpected truth and a shared purpose. News of Julian's spectacular fall from grace spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles. It wasn't long before Eleanor appeared at our front door. She arrived looking artfully distressed, with tears making clean tracks through her perfect makeup. The familiar scent of her expensive Chanel perfume filled the hallway. "Davis, darling," she cried, clutching my hands desperately. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You can't let this happen to Julian. You don't understand the pressure he was under or the terrible people he got mixed up with." Her voice trembled with practiced grief. "He made mistakes, yes, terrible mistakes. But he's your brother. Family forgives. You have to help him. Talk to Lawrence. Talk to the lawyers." Behind the tears, I saw the calculation in her eyes. It was the same look she used to have when she convinced me to take the blame for some vase Julian had broken. She wasn't just pleading for her favored son. She was trying to salvage the family's reputation and her own social standing. "Mother," I said, gently disengaging my hands from hers. "Julian isn't just facing company sanctions. He's being investigated for multiple counts of financial fraud, conspiracy, and possibly violating medical ethics regulations. This is far beyond a family disagreement." I looked at her pointedly. "Did you know about the offshore accounts he was using? The ones set up to channel funds from the Jensen deal?" Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly for just a second before her mask of grief snapped back into place. But she knew. Of course she knew. She might have even benefited from it. Her silence was its own answer. "Family forgives, Mother," I said quietly. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." I showed her out, unmoved by her renewed wave of dramatic sobs. 3 days later, the consequences arrived in person. Julian showed up at our house, but he wasn't the polished, charming Julian anymore. He was a broken version of himself, unshaven and haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expensive suit was rumpled and stained. The police investigation had moved swiftly. His assets were frozen and his accounts were inaccessible. His fiancée, the one he'd been seeing while planning to use me, had vanished. His so-called friends weren't answering his calls anymore. He practically fell through the doorway when I opened it. He sank to his knees on the cool marble floor of the foyer, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "Davis, please," he sobbed, the words catching in his throat. "I messed up so badly. The gambling, it got out of control. These guys, they threatened me, Davis. They threatened Mom." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "I was desperate. I never meant for things to go this far. I never meant to hurt Isabella. Not permanently." Rain lashed against the tall windows, providing a dramatic soundtrack to his breakdown. Isabella watched silently from the archway leading to the living room. She wasn't in her wheelchair today. She was standing with her cane, her expression unreadable but steady. "You're my brother," Julian choked out. He grabbed at my trousers like a drowning man. "My little brother. If you talk to them, tell them I was under duress. Tell them I made mistakes, but I'm not a criminal. Please, Davis, help me." I pulled him up and led him to a chair in the living room. I even went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, placing the steaming mug on the table between us. I let him talk. I listened patiently to the flood of excuses, justifications, pleadings, and self-pity. He blamed the loan sharks, the pressure, and his own bad luck. He even subtly blamed me for not being supportive enough earlier. When he finally ran out of words, he slumped in the chair, looking exhausted and empty. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times, each stroke echoing in the quiet room. I looked at him, the man who was my brother. This was the man who had betrayed me twice, who had been willing to sacrifice both me and Isabella for his own gain. I felt nothing. I felt no anger and no pity, just a vast emptiness where brotherly feeling used to be. "No, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but absolutely firm. "I won't intervene. I won't lie for you, and I won't minimize what you did." The rain outside had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to break. A sliver of moon was visible in the clear, cold night sky through the window. "You had choices," I continued calmly. "Every step of the way, you made choices. You chose to gamble, you chose to borrow from dangerous people, and you chose to manipulate me. You chose to exploit Isabella and to commit fraud. You had opportunities to stop, to ask for help honestly, and to choose a different path. You didn't." His face crumpled completely. The last vestiges of his entitled confidence dissolved, leaving behind the stark reality of his situation. What happens to me now?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. I stood up and gestured toward the door. "That," I replied. My voice was devoid of malice, but equally devoid of sympathy. "That is no longer my concern." 2 years melted away after that night. The sharp edges of the past had finally been smoothed over. We stood on a beach, but not just any beach. It was a private island villa in the Maldives. The property was owned by the Harrison Foundation for Research Retreats. The sand was powder soft under my bare feet, and the setting sun bled vibrant colors across the turquoise water. There were vibrant oranges, deep purples, and soft golds in the sky. Isabella walked ahead of me along the shoreline, no longer needing a cane or walking with a limp. She moved with a natural, easy stride. Her recovery had been steady and remarkable, fueled by the very treatments her family had pioneered and her own quiet determination. She bent down, her dark hair falling forward as she examined a seashell. Her silhouette was perfectly framed against the dazzling sunset. It was a sight I never got tired of, a daily miracle I never took for granted. Nearby, Lawrence Harrison stood partially in the shade of a palm tree. He was speaking quietly into his phone. Even here, he was working, but his tone was different now. He was less guarded and more collaborative. He was likely finalizing details for the latest grant expansion, bringing the Phoenix Project protocols to more hospitals. He was making the treatment accessible beyond the wealthy elite. The salt-laced breeze carried the sweet fragrance of plumeria from the villa's garden. We planned to have dinner there later, just the 3 of us, under a canopy of stars that were impossibly bright and far from the glow of any city. Our life back home had found a new rhythm, too. We kept a much lower profile than the Harrison family traditionally had. The opulent galas and high society events held little appeal for either of us. Instead, we lived in the penthouse apartment atop the Harrison Institute. It was a place that felt more like a home than the grand estate we'd occupied before. Isabella had turned the large rooftop conservatory into her personal sanctuary. Mornings often found her there, tending to her collection of rare orchids with movements that were fluid and confident. Sunlight streamed through the glass panels, illuminating the lush greenery. I worked from my home office, which overlooked the city, but my gaze often drifted toward the conservatory. Watching her gave me a quiet sense of peace that settled over my soul. The distant hum of the city 30 floors below felt worlds away. Our apartment was an island of calm, floating high above the urban sprawl. We had finally found our own definition of normal. The Harrison Medical Foundation, once a closely guarded secret, was now a globally recognized name. It was a leader in neurological recovery. It wasn't just about patents and profits anymore. Under Isabella's guidance and with Lawrence's support, its mission had shifted. The annual benefit gala was now less about social climbing and more about showcasing progress and raising funds for patient access programs. Last month, Isabella had stood confidently at the podium, her voice clear and strong as she announced a new initiative. She was providing free treatment protocols to underfunded hospitals in developing countries. The camera flashes illuminated the room as I joined her on stage. Our hands found each other in a subtle, supportive squeeze. Looking out at the audience, I saw hope reflected in their faces. There were doctors, researchers, patients, and families. The champagne flutes on the tables remained mostly full because people were more interested in the detailed scientific discussions. They were networking and collaborating long after the formal presentations ended. It felt like a legacy redefined, focused on healing rather than just accumulating wealth. Occasionally, news of Julian would filter through to us indirectly. He'd accepted a plea bargain, receiving reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation. He testified against the loan sharks and made full restitution, which is frozen assets mostly covered. Part of his sentence involved mandatory community service. He was assigned to a neurological rehabilitation center, a place that used a simplified version of the Harrison protocols. Someone sent Isabella a discreet photo of him. It was clipped from a local volunteer newsletter. It showed Julian looking thinner and more sober, helping an elderly stroke patient practice gripping a therapy ball. He looked diminished, but perhaps he was finally humbled. That evening, as we were getting ready for bed, the city lights painted patterns on the ceiling. Isabella asked quietly, "Do you think he's actually changed?" I thought about it while folding back the crisp linen sheets. Changed? Maybe. He's definitely been punished. Whether he's remorseful is hard to say. I answered slowly, he's learning what it means to serve something or someone other than himself. Maybe for the first time in his life. I paused, considering the thought. That's a start, I suppose. There was no bitterness left in my voice. I had no lingering anger, just a quiet acceptance. His path was his own now, running parallel to ours but no longer intersecting. The following week marked the anniversary of Isabella's awakening. We didn't celebrate with parties or fanfare. Instead, we went hiking along a quiet path. We walked through the Arashiyama bamboo grove in Kyoto, something Isabella had mentioned wanting to do during the long months of her recovery. The towering bamboo stalks created a serene green canopy overhead, filtering the autumn sunlight. Fallen maple leaves carpeted the ancient stone path in shades of crimson and gold. Their earthy scent rose with each step we took. Isabella paused, raising her phone, but not to capture the famous bamboo forest itself. She took a picture of me as I gazed up at the swaying stalks. She lowered the phone, a thoughtful expression on her face. "When you look ahead now," she asked, tucking her hand into mine as we resumed walking, "what do you see?" The path wound gently uphill between bamboo that had stood for generations, enduring storms and seasons as a testament to resilience. I thought about my first life, which had been consumed by bitterness and loss. I thought about the beginning of this life, which had been driven by a need for revenge. But standing here now, with Isabella beside me, the future felt different. It wasn't predetermined, and it wasn't something to be feared or manipulated. It's something to be built. I don't see exactly what will happen anymore, I answered truthfully, squeezing her hand. I just see us making it happen together. The path opened into a clearing bathed in the warm afternoon light. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, the future felt truly, genuinely bright. We may not be able to restart our lives like Davis did, but we can choose to wake up at any moment. True victory is not about meticulously plotting to destroy a frenemy. It is about reclaiming sovereignty over your life from the scripts others have written for you. You should take the energy once wasted on resentment and internal conflict and use it for deep love and building a better future. If you currently feel trapped or misunderstood, remember that seeing the situation for what it is constitutes wisdom, while holding your ground is true strength. You don't need to travel back in time like Davis. You only need to refuse to be a supporting character in your own destiny from this moment forward. I hope that in this game of life, you not only win back your dignity, but also become the clear-headed, free, and powerful version of yourself.